Good evening, sleepy soul. Before we dive into this unbelievably slow-paced story about shoes, please do 3 simple yet crucial things. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and drop a comment telling us your city and the current time on your clock. We absolutely don't need this information, but it brings us joy and the illusion of a global shoe-loving community. Now then, get comfortable. Picture the year 1261, foggy England. People haven't discovered soap yet, but they're really trying to invent something that doesn't tear the skin off their heels. Because walking barefoot is only romantic until you step in a puddle of medieval manure. And manure, as you know, happens often. In a tiny village with a name so complicated we won't even attempt to pronounce it, it sounds like Tripledon upon Blarg, a very quiet and very slow cobbler named Godwin had a thought. What if, instead of tying a rawhide slab to my foot every morning with twine, I just stitched 2 pieces together? And that was the moment history lost one more excuse for calluses. Godwin took the hide of a cow, who, by the way, wasn't thrilled with the idea, but history rarely asks permission, and stitched it together with a bone needle he'd found in an old soup. Thus was born what we now call a shoe of average firmness and questionable symmetry. The village was stunned. "It's like feet, but better," cried the town miller, who frequently confused shoes with goats. Godwin began making shoes on commission, but not for fashion. Oh no, this was functional art, a shoe sturdy enough to walk through coal, hay, ale, and even the soul of the local tax collector. And though the shoes had no left or right, because medieval society didn't recognize sides or proper medical licensing, they were revolutionary. Most importantly, they squeaked loudly. So much so, enemies fled in fear, mistaking the sound for ghosts. Chapter 1. Rotten Calluses. Life before the shoe. Let's take a deep, unhurried breath and drift even further back in time. Before the noble squeak of Godwin's revolutionary creation echoed through foggy villages. Before the concept of comfort was even a twinkle in the eye of medieval misery. Yes, we are speaking of the great, uncushioned age of the barefoot era. In this era, roughly between the year whenever and 1261, feet were not feet. They were weapons, tools, sponges, and regrettable mistakes. People walked through fields, forests, swamps, and the occasional kitchen fire without the slightest hint of foot protection. The result? Toes that looked like overcooked parsnips and heels that sounded like dry wood when tapped. Children were born directly into the dirt. The midwife would catch the baby, spank it gently, then nod solemnly and say, "He's got strong soles. He'll make it through mud season." Men went to war barefoot. Women farmed barefoot. Even monks, those champions of indoor peace, occasionally forgot to wear sandals and slipped on their own humility. But perhaps the worst fate was reserved for the traveling beggar, a man whose job description was walk endlessly through sharp things while apologizing for existing. His feet were so calloused he used them to crack nuts. Squirrels watched and wept. And then there was the toenail situation. Ah, yes, a subject best whispered. Toenails, you see, had dreams back then. They longed to grow sideways, curled, twisted, rebelled. One priest declared them to be a sign of inner sin. Another tried to exorcise one. It did not go well. So, how did people survive? Badly, but with creativity. Some wrapped their feet in straw. Others used bark. One famously eccentric merchant from Lincolnshire reportedly trained a family of hedgehogs to walk beneath his feet like moving slippers. This worked for approximately 4 hours, then became a tragic folk ballad. Yet, for all the suffering, no one questioned it. Foot pain was like rain, or taxes, or soup made from moss, simply a fact of life. And when a toe fell off from frostbite, people just pointed and said, "That one's lighter now." Enter the medieval mindset. In this era, any attempt to improve life was met with suspicion. One man tried to invent a fork and was accused of being in league with Satan. Another proposed the idea of a soft chair and was promptly laughed into a swamp. So the idea of a protective foot covering, something to keep toes together and manure at bay, was not obvious. It was radical. It was absurd. It was dangerous. And yet, in a village that smelled perpetuously of wet bread and cow anxiety, a quiet cobbler was sharpening his soup bone needle. But that is a tale for another chapter. Chapter 2. Leather Soup, the birth of the first shoe. They say every great invention begins with a spark of genius. This one began with soup. Not good soup. No, medieval soup, which was less of a recipe and more of a dare. A questionable broth of onion peel, wet hay, and something that might have once been a squirrel. And floating in that murky bowl, like an omen, or perhaps a mistake, was a single curved bone needle, the only utensil Cobbler Godwin ever needed. Godwin was not a man of many words, or thoughts, or teeth, for that matter. But he had what scholars now call quiet desperation. His feet hurt constantly. There were nights he'd lie awake, staring at the straw ceiling of his mud hut, contemplating whether he still had toes, or if they had abandoned him during the last frost. One evening, after stepping directly onto a frozen turnip, a common medieval hazard, Godwin limped back into his hut, collapsed onto a wooden plank he called a bed, and muttered the 5 words that would shake shoe history forever. There must be another way. He stared at the cowhide draped in the corner, drying slowly from its recent wash in fermented barley water. His brain, unused to so much activity, sparked once, then twice, then fizzled. But just before going to sleep, one thought stuck. What if I wore the cow instead of eating it? The next morning, he returned to his bowl of soup. Still there, the curved bone needle. Likely from a goat or a chicken, or some now extinct creature known as the mudbeak. Godwin took the needle, bit a strip of leather, and, with all the enthusiasm of a man who hadn't felt his heels in a decade, began to stitch. It was not elegant. The first attempt looked like a folded omelet. The second resembled a sad purse. The third attempt, which he proudly wore around the village, was immediately pecked to pieces by a goose who mistook it for a rival. Still, he persisted. By the seventh iteration, something happened. The leather bent just right. The toe curled politely. The back hugged the heel like a concerned grandmother. He stood up, took a step, and for the first time in decades, he did not scream. The village was silent, then erupted in slow, confused applause. "Is he wearing the cow?" asked the blacksmith. "No," said the miller. "The cow is wearing him." A fair point. The early prototypes extended well past the knee and required a companion to help remove them. But progress had been made. Godwin began producing more shoes, not pairs. That would imply symmetry. Each shoe was a stand-alone masterpiece of confusion. Some had soles, others had holes. Some had laces made of pig intestine, others were tied with hope and dry grass. He began charging for them in the local currency: onions, soap rumors, and secrets about the Baron's illegitimate children. Soon, the cobbler's hut became the center of village life. Pilgrims arrived with blistered feet, knights with soggy boots. One monk came seeking divine arch support. Godwin, humbled by his fame, spoke only in whispers, and sometimes, for reasons unknown, meowed. And all of it, all the revolution, all the foot-based salvation, had begun with a spoonful of questionably seasoned destiny. Chapter 3. Is it a goat or a shoe? The village struggles. For many villagers, change was not welcome, especially if that change came in the form of something stitched, smelly, and vaguely hoof-shaped. Godwin's shoes, though groundbreaking, had a visual problem. You see, goats were common in the village, very common. They wandered freely, they climbed on roofs, and, in at least 3 confirmed cases, ran local gambling rings. But most importantly, they had roughly the same shape, smell, and size as Godwin's earliest footwear prototypes. This led to what medieval scholars now call the Great Goat Confusion of 1262. It began innocently enough. Old Thomas the candlemaker mistook a sleeping goat for one of Godwin's new shoes and tried to wear it. The goat, not being a fan of public service, bit him directly on the earlobe and filed a formal complaint with the local priest. Then came Edna. Edna, the herbalist, was a proud woman, proud of her potion rack, proud of her beard, proud of her left foot, which she claimed had once stepped on a demon. When she received a custom-made Godwin shoe, dark brown, with a spiral toe and a decorative wart, she wore it proudly to the spring fair. "Behold," she shouted, "the future of feet!" A child screamed. A dog fainted. The mayor slipped into a theological panic. Because to everyone else, it looked like she'd skinned a goat and was wearing its face. Word spread fast. By dusk, rumors had blossomed like poorly stored cheese. One said the shoes were made of demons. Another claimed Godwin was summoning footwear spirits through soup-based rituals. A third insisted the shoes were actually cursed goats who had agreed to protect feet in exchange for eternal companionship. In a time before newspapers, truth was a loose and clumsy animal. Godwin, to his credit, remained calm. He nailed a sign outside his hut. Not goats, shoes, thank you. He even held a public demonstration, placing a shoe beside a goat and saying, "See, different." The goat then ate the shoe, which did not help his argument. Still, support grew. A few brave villagers, mostly those who had recently stepped on bees or sharp pebbles, decided they didn't care what the shoes looked like. One of them, a man named Garth, who had 11 toes and no standards, proclaimed, "Let the goats judge me. My feet are dry." And so a silent war began. On one side, traditionalists, barefoot purists, and people who trusted no leather not attached to a cow. On the other, the newly dubbed soul supporters, a ragtag collection of limping visionaries. There were skirmishes. Children threw clogs. An outraged shepherdess tried to hex the cobbler's hut with spoiled milk. Someone painted a goat on Godwin's door with the words, "Nice try." But there was no going back. Shoes had entered the village consciousness, and though they still looked like sleeping animals, smelled like wet firewood, and creaked like haunted floorboards, they were loved. Reluctantly, confusedly, but loved. Chapter 4. Mud Walk Runway, the first fashion disaster. It started with the trumpet, a crooked one, played badly by a man with only half a lung and an unfortunate sense of rhythm. The village, still emotionally recovering from the goat shoe controversy, decided it was time to make things official, to calm the skeptics, to dazzle the nobles, to prove once and for all that Godwin shoes were not only functional, but fashionable. Thus was born the first annual Mud Walk Parade. Organized by Mayor Brambleton, a man who wore a chain of office and nothing else, weather permitting, the event promised to be the most exciting thing to happen since the blacksmith's pig gave birth to a turnip. Villagers arrived early, some wearing shoes, others barefoot but smug. The stage? A 12-meter path of flattened reeds and damp soil. The models? Whoever hadn't said no fast enough. The stakes? Immense. Godwin, now both revered and feared, spent 3 whole evenings crafting his finest collection. Each shoe was stitched by candlelight, soaked in juniper water for shine, and sprayed with what he claimed was mystical shoe perfume, but was probably ale. He named the models himself. The Toe Whisperer, long, narrow, and designed to creak musically. The Squish Lord, padded with moss and regret. The Royal Blister, lined with feathers which molted on impact. And, of course, Midnight Goose, which featured black leather and a pointed toe shaped like a beak. The event began precisely 4 hours late, on schedule by medieval standards. The first model, a farmer named Ulf, stepped onto the runway wearing the Squish Lord. Every step emitted a moist plop. The audience nodded. A few clapped. One person vomited, but that may have been unrelated. Next came Edna the herbalist, back in her controversial spiral toe shoe, now upgraded with wildflowers and a smell no one could explain. She twirled once, tripped, fell into the mayor, and knocked his ceremonial bucket off his head. "Fashion!" someone shouted. A child burst into tears. Then came Midnight Goose. The model, a knight named Bernard, who had never walked on anything but mud and arrogance, strutted proudly, until the shoe's beak snagged on a root. He catapulted into the cabbage stand, broke 3 ribs, and was later declared moderately stylish. It was a disaster. A beautiful, muddy, toe-jamming disaster. Still, something shifted. People talked. Old Agnes, who hadn't worn shoes in 40 years due to philosophical reasons, asked to try on the Toe Whisperer. She wept, not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, but because she'd forgotten what it felt like to have 5 toes at once. A bard composed a ballad. "O leather-born ye footy friend, with seams that creak and ends that bend." And just like that, fashion had tiptoed into a village that didn't know what to do with it. There were no rules, no trends, only questions. Do shoes need to match? Should they have holes? Why do mine smell like soup? Godwin smiled through it all, because he knew the shoes weren't good, but they were seen. And in a world where half the people still believed frogs were witches, that was more than enough. Chapter 5. The Tax Collector and the Puddle. A Survival Test. Some say innovation is born of necessity. Others say it's born of wet socks. In either case, the true test of Godwin's revolutionary footwear came not in a parade, nor in a fashion duel, nor even in Edna's tragic interpretive dance. No, the moment of truth squelched into the village one gray morning on 2 very unfortunate feet. His name was Elgar. Occupation? Royal tax collector. Natural predators? Villagers with pitchforks and untreated emotional trauma. Elgar arrived wearing a wool cloak, 3 layers of disdain, and a pair of thin leather slippers so flimsy they once lost a fight to a dandelion. His expression was fixed in what scholars describe as permanent irritation with the universe. His job? To collect 17 turnips, a sack of barley, and, by clerical error, 1 child. He entered the village just as the skies began to weep. Medieval weather reports were usually just someone looking outside and muttering, "Ah." The rain fell. The ground soaked. The puddles expanded. Godwin was sitting outside his hut, peacefully stitching a shoe that looked like a bat with anxiety issues. He watched as Elgar, unaware of local terrain, physics, or humility, marched straight into the great puddle of Troughley Lane. The splash could be heard as far as the goose barn. The villagers gasped. Several ran for towels. One man fainted. He was very sensitive to moisture. Elgar froze. His slippers squelched. A thin layer of swamp matter clung to his ankles like gossip. He turned, slowly, and locked eyes with Elgar. "Cobbler," he hissed, "this village owes the crown 27 turnips, not 17. Godwin blinked, then pointed to the puddle, then, very calmly, held up a shoe. A beautiful shoe.
Well, not beautiful, but solid. It had thick soles made from triple-layered oxhide, dried over a forge, and accidentally blessed by a monk who sneezed mid-sermon. It had a toe that pointed vaguely forward, and a smell only mildly offensive. Godwin offered the shoe to Elgar like a peace offering, or a dare. Elgar stared. Villagers held their breath. Then, slowly, the tax collector took off his squishy slippers and slipped the shoe onto one foot. Then the other. There was a pause. Then a step. No squelch. Another step. Still dry. He looked down. He looked up. He blinked twice, a known sign of spiritual rebirth. "These," he said at last, "do not feel like misery." He turned to the villagers. "I hereby reduce your turnip debt by 1. And with that he stumped away, through mud, through puddles, through small rodents. The shoes held. He didn't slip, he didn't yelp, he didn't curse the gods. It was, by all accounts, the first time in recorded tax history that a bureaucrat had walked through filth and smiled. Godwin returned to his stitching, a small smirk on his face. Somewhere in the distance a rainbow formed. It immediately faded. This was still medieval England, but the point had been made. Shoes weren't just fashion. They were survival. Chapter 5. The Tax Collector and the Puddle. A Survival Test. Some say innovation is born of necessity. Others say it's born of wet socks. In either case, the true test of Godwin's revolutionary footwear came not in a parade, nor in a fashion duel, nor even in Edna's tragic interpretive dance. No, the moment of truth squelched into the village one gray morning on 2 very unfortunate feet. His name was Elgar. Occupation? Royal tax collector. Natural predators? Villagers with pitchforks and untreated emotional trauma. Elgar arrived wearing a wool cloak, 3 layers of disdain, and a pair of thin leather slippers so flimsy they once lost a fight to a dandelion. His expression was fixed in what scholars describe as permanent irritation with the universe. His job? To collect 17 turnips, a sack of barley, and, by clerical error, 1 child. He entered the village just as the skies began to weep. Medieval weather reports were usually just someone looking outside and muttering, "Ah." The rain fell. The ground soaked. The puddles expanded. Godwin was sitting outside his hut, peacefully stitching a shoe that looked like a bat with anxiety issues. He watched as Elgar, unaware of local terrain, physics, or humility, marched straight into the great puddle of Troughley Lane. The splash could be heard as far as the goose barn. The villagers gasped. Several ran for towels. One man fainted. He was very sensitive to moisture. Elgar froze. His slippers squelched. A thin layer of swamp matter clung to his ankles like gossip. He turned, slowly, and locked eyes with Elgar. "Cobbler," he hissed, "this village owes the crown 27 turnips, not 17. Godwin blinked, then pointed to the puddle, then, very calmly, held up a shoe. A beautiful shoe. Well, not beautiful, but solid. It had thick soles made from triple-layered oxhide, dried over a forge, and accidentally blessed by a monk who sneezed mid-sermon. It had a toe that pointed vaguely forward, and a smell only mildly offensive. Godwin offered the shoe to Elgar like a peace offering, or a dare. Elgar stared. Villagers held their breath. Then, slowly, the tax collector took off his squishy slippers and slipped the shoe onto one foot. Then the other. There was a pause. Then a step. No squelch. Another step. Still dry. He looked down. He looked up. He blinked twice. A known sign of spiritual rebirth. These, he said at last, do not feel like misery. He turned to the villagers. I hereby reduce your turnip debt by 1. And with that he stumped away, through mud, through puddles, through small rodents. The shoes held. He didn't slip. He didn't yelp. He didn't curse the gods. It was, by all accounts, the first time in recorded tax history that a bureaucrat had walked through filth and smiled. Godwin returned to his stitching, a small smirk on his face. Somewhere in the distance, a rainbow formed. It immediately faded. This was still medieval England, but the point had been made. Shoes weren't just fashion. They were survival.
Chapter 6. Bloody Stitches and Bone Needles. Cobbler Tech. The road to innovation is paved with trial, error, and a great deal of blood. In Godwin's case, that blood was almost exclusively his own. Shoemaking in the 13th century was not for the faint of heart, nor for anyone particularly attached to their fingers. Godwin's workshop, a term used generously, was a lopsided shack with a roof made from straw, bark, and whatever the wind decided to throw at it that week. Inside, the air smelled of leather, old turnips, and ambition. Tools were scattered across a workbench he'd inherited from a carpenter who had mistaken Godwin's hut for a bakery and never returned. There was no instruction manual, no blueprint, no YouTube tutorial titled How to Make Shoes Without Crying. All he had was instinct, a curved bone needle, and a nearly superhuman ability to tolerate discomfort. The bone needle, still stained from its early days in soup and mystery, was both his sword and his saboteur. It pierced leather like a champion, and fingers like a jealous ex. Godwin's hands were a canvas of tiny cuts, bruises, and one suspiciously shoe-shaped scar he insisted was a birthmark. The thread was animal sinew, tough, stretchy, smelled like guilt. The leather was cowhide, stiff, reluctant, slightly haunted. The workbench creaked, constantly, loud enough that it was once accused of witchcraft. He didn't use a shoehorn. He used an actual horn from a goat. The same goat that had once tried to eat his left prototype, Poetic Justice. Each shoe took hours, sometimes days, occasionally weeks if the weather was uncooperative or his hands refused to function out of protest. And yet, somehow, he improved. The soles grew thicker, the toe boxes rounder, the laces tighter and more occasionally centered. He began experimenting. One model had holes in the side for ventilation, though they mostly just let in more mud. Another was lined with hay, cozy until it got wet and smelled like wet sadness. One infamous attempt featured decorative bells, which attracted wolves. That model was discontinued. Villagers would peek in as he worked, mesmerized by the slow dance of needle through hide. Children watched with awe. Adults watched with skepticism. One monk watched with binoculars, but no one questioned it. It was the 1200s. Godwin started naming his techniques. The triple tug stitch, durable, though likely to sever a tendon if rushed. The reverse curl bind, elegant, but only functional on feet shaped like turnips. The spiral of regret, a method involving circular threading and 3 days of emotional recovery. And still, he stitched. Shoes for farmers, for barmaids, for lost pilgrims, for one very drunk knight who requested something squishy but angry. The shoes were flawed, imperfect, sometimes terrifying, but they were his. Every stitch was a rebellion against barefoot misery. Every drop of blood was a down payment on progress. And somewhere, beneath the dirt and bandages and occasional goat droppings, the medieval world was changing, one uneven step at a time. Chapter 7. Left, right, welcome to footwear anarchy. Modern shoes come in pairs, tidy, obedient pairs, one left, one right, as if your feet are polite co-workers going to the same meeting. But in 1262, such civility was unthinkable. You see, the medieval mind didn't care for symmetry. This was an age where windows were optional, forks were scandalous, and your doctor's main qualification was survived a week without dying. Feet, it was believed, were mostly the same, one just slightly less disappointing than the other. And so, in Godwin's early designs, all shoes were made equal. They were shaped like the concept of a foot, not an actual foot. Long, rounded, slightly bulbous, like an ambitious turnip or a mildly deformed potato. There was no left, there was no right. There was only shoe. Villagers accepted this with the same resigned shrug they gave everything else. It fits both feet? Well, it also fits the cat, the ladle, and my cousin's head, so yes. At first, this egalitarian approach seemed noble, democratic. Anyone could wear any shoe. Your neighbor's shoe, your shoe. Found one in a ditch? Perfect. Lost one? Doesn't matter. Your other shoe will do double duty. But cracks soon appeared in the philosophy. Not literal cracks, though yes, those too, but philosophical ones. See, feet are traitorous little asymmetrical beasts. One points slightly left, one arches like a guilty lie. And no matter how identical two shoes appear, the foot knows. It whispers, it rebels, it blisters. Complaints began to rise. My left toe is whispering threats. My heel feels gaslighted. My arch packed a bag and left during the night. Godwin, too, began to notice strange things. Shoes wore unevenly. People limped in patterns that could be tracked across mud. One man began walking in a circle and couldn't stop. Another claimed his foot had developed an accent. But instead of panic, there was curiosity. Godwin began labeling shoes not as left or right, but as more comfortable and less regretful. Some he named after local landmarks, Churchill and Angry Rock. One set was simply labeled Good Luck. He experimented with subtle changes, a tilt in the sole, a mysterious bulge near the arch, a depression in the heel that doubled as emergency cheese storage. Soon, Godwin's hut was filled with shoes that looked identical but felt different. People began arguing over which one was the correct shoe for their dominant foot. Children fought over who got the sneaky one. The mayor declared his right shoe to be a liar and refused to wear it again. Chaos. Delightful, foot-based chaos. Eventually, a truce was found. Godwin began carving tiny runes on the inside of each shoe. Nothing meaningful, just vague advice like, trust no ducks, or your left is someone else's right. People liked that. And so, the concept of paired shoes, while still decades away from being fully realized, was born not out of science, but superstition, confusion, and mild toe trauma. But progress is like a medieval ox, slow, stinky, but eventually moving in the right direction. Sort of. Chapter 8. The shoe becomes a weapon. The squeak of doom. The squeak. It began as an accident, a byproduct of wet leather, poorly aged moss lining, and the particular squish of Godwin's fermentation method, which involved leaving shoes near the communal outhouse to absorb the energy of the village. But the first time it happened, truly happened, was unforgettable. It was night. A full moon loomed over the village, casting its pale light across roofs, haystacks, and at least one couple arguing about soup. Godwin, returning from the tavern with a mild limp and a head full of invention, stepped into the street wearing a new prototype. The moment his heel hit the mud, the sound rang out like an insult to silence. Squeak! Birds took flight. A goat fainted. The local blacksmith screamed and dropped his anvil. Godwin paused. He took another step. Squaw! Two children began to cry. An owl asked to be relocated. By morning, the entire village was talking. Was it a ghost? A beast? The spirit of last year's tax error come to seek revenge? Godwin remained silent, mysterious. He let the myth build. The next day, he modified the shoe slightly, added a patch of frog skin, a hidden air pocket, and a knot of twine soaked in beet juice. The result? A louder, more aggressive squeak with just a touch of existential dread. He gave it to the butcher. The butcher, a man of few emotions and even fewer bathing habits, stomped down the main road on market day. With each step, squee, grunk, scaw. People fled. The miller dropped his grain. The barmaid locked the end door. Even the priest pretended to faint to avoid confrontation. Suddenly, the shoe was no longer just footwear. It was a statement, a tool, a deterrent. Godwin was flooded with requests. Make one that sounds like a goose in labor. I want a scream shoe for my left foot only. Can it hiss when I walk near my ex-wife? He obliged. The shoe of thunder, the whimper toe, the infamous stalker model, which squeaked only when you stopped moving. And the people wielded them like weapons. Tax collectors retreated. Bandits avoided the village altogether. One knight claimed his squeaky boots won the war before it even started. Soon, Godwin's hut was filled not just with villagers, but mercenaries. "Make me a boot that moans like a dying goat," one demanded. "Something subtle," whispered another, "like a banshee giving up." But power has its price. One evening, during the midsummer feast, 20 people wore Godwin's squeak shoes at once. The sound was so unbearable, it cracked a window and caused a nearby monk to renounce music entirely. From that day forward, the squeak ban was introduced. No more than 2 per gathering, none inside churches, and absolutely no sneaky squeaks during courtship. Godwin, unbothered, simply nodded. He knew. The shoe was no longer just a protector of the foot. It was a symbol, a siren, a call to arms, or at least mild intimidation. And all because one man dared to walk with audible conviction. Chapter 9. Infantry and Footwear. Teaching Armies to Walk. War in the 1200s was not known for its elegance. It was mostly mud, shouting, and 2 men in rusty armor arguing over whether a goat counted as a siege weapon. Foot soldiers, or as they were affectionately called, the expendables, trudged into battle wearing whatever was available: bits of cloth, wooden slats, or in one case, hollowed out bread. And then came Godwin's shoes. Word had spread, slowly at first, carried by traveling monks and unusually stylish messengers. But soon, stories emerged across the land. There's a village where the peasants walk through puddles without weeping. They have shoes that bite back. Their cobbler squeaks like thunder. The royal quartermaster, a man named Sir Wilbert von Sneef, was intrigued. He arrived at Godwin's door one rainy morning with a scroll, a pouch of coins, and a horse that looked deeply unimpressed with its job. Sir Wilbert declared, "The king's army requires shoes, durable, flexible, possibly edible in emergencies." Godwin, who had just finished designing a sandal for pigs, nodded. He agreed, but only on one condition: that no one question his methods. The deal was struck. And so began the first known military shoe commission in medieval history. Godwin worked day and night. He recruited apprentices, a deaf baker, a mute blacksmith, and Edna, who refused to speak but communicated solely through eyebrow movements. Together, they crafted 117 combat-grade shoes. They came in 2 styles: the Marchmaster, reinforced with boiled leather and lined with goat wool, sturdy, heavy, slightly menacing; the Sneaker, thin, quiet, ideal for creeping up on your enemy or sneaking out of church. The day of delivery arrived. Soldiers lined up, some skeptical, some barefoot, all slightly damp. Godwin handed out the shoes. There were complications. The first soldier to try his on yelped and asked, "Is it supposed to hum?" "Yes," Godwin replied. "It's for morale." Another tried running. He tripped, fell, and shouted, "This one curves." Godwin smiled.
That's the tactical side bend. Despite the confusion and one incident involving a shoe and a squirrel nest, the results were undeniable. Within days, the infantry was marching further, faster, with fewer complaints. They didn't bleed from the heels. They didn't stop every mile to cry quietly behind a tree. In one glorious moment, a battalion crossed a swamp without losing a single toenail. The general wept. Victory followed, not because of strategy or valor, but because one army showed up with footwear. Their enemies, barefoot, blistered, demoralized, surrendered almost immediately after stepping on a pine cone. By winter, Godwin had become a military asset. His face appeared on coins. His shoes were gifted to foreign diplomats. One rumor claimed the Pope wore a pair and immediately canceled 3 crusades due to unexpected comfort. And yet, he remained humble. When asked for comment, Godwin simply muttered, "I just didn't want wet feet." The soldiers agreed. He may not have been a hero, but he was the reason they could walk away like one.
Chapter 10. Anti-Slip Engineering, when manure got less lethal. If medieval life had a final boss, it wasn't war, it wasn't famine, it wasn't even the Inquisition. It was manure. Everywhere, always. It was the great, steaming constant of existence, lovingly dropped by cows, goats, oxen, and the occasional mysterious creature known only as Clive. It gathered in streets, in stables, in bedrooms sometimes, if the windows were open and the wind particularly cruel. And it was slippery, dangerously so. You could be a proud nobleman marching to a duel and suddenly become a tragic smear on the cobblestones. Priests delivered sermons while wearing skis. Midwives were regularly launched into bushes. The mayor's horse once fell so hard it became 2 horses. No one questioned it. Shoes, for all their warmth and style, did nothing against this threat. In fact, they often made it worse. Early Godwin models were smooth-bottomed, elegant in theory, but slicker than eel butter in practice. Villagers began referring to them as foot sleds. So, Godwin, ever the reluctant innovator, returned to his workshop. Determined and slightly covered in fertilizer. He began his experiments with grip. First attempt: nail spikes into the soles. Result: impressive traction, but also turned every shoe into a medieval bear trap. Several chickens were lost. Second attempt: glue hay to the bottom. Result: decent on dry terrain, but once wet, the hay became a kind of fermented mush that attracted bees, lovers of chaos. Third attempt: grooved soles, carved by hand. This one worked. Sort of. By dragging a sharpened spoon across the leather sole in a zigzag pattern, Godwin created tiny channels, allowing mud and manure to move away from the foot instead of bonding with it spiritually. He named the invention the Groove of Destiny, which was met with some applause, and one fainting, but again unrelated. He refined the method, alternating spirals, deeper cuts, asymmetrical patterns meant to confuse the manure into thinking it was not welcome. Soon, the difference was undeniable. People walked with confidence. They turned corners at full peasant speed. Elderly monks danced again. One even attempted a cartwheel before being gently escorted home. Godwin also introduced a new concept: seasonal treads. For summer, light grooves, perfect for dry dung. For winter, deep ruts, capable of channeling away snow, sleet, and goose-based accidents. For holy days, decorative soles, shaped like saints, which still slipped but looked impressive when falling. Eventually, the town council, after stepping into a puddle and not dying, declared Godwin's shoes a public health initiative. He was awarded an honorary title, Lord of the Anti-Slide. A plaque was nailed to the shoe shop. It immediately fell off. It was muddy. But the point stood. The war on manure had a hero. And thanks to him, the village could finally walk, not just with protection, but with pride.
Chapter 11. Mold and Elegance. The Shoemaker's Tournament. Fashion in the medieval world was mostly about survival. If your tunic didn't itch and your pants stayed on during a windstorm, you were already ahead of the game. But once Godwin's shoes took root, sometimes literally if left outside too long, a strange and dangerous thing happened. People began to care what they looked like. And with this awakening came the most unnecessary event in village history: the first shoemaker's tournament. It began as a joke. Someone, likely Edna, though she never confessed, suggested that since Godwin was so proud of his inventions, perhaps others should too. Within days, 3 rival cobblers emerged from the mud like overly confident mushrooms. Osric the over-decorator, known for adding feathers to everything, including taxes. Marta of Moldfin, specialized in natural aging, which mostly meant forgetting to dry the leather. Rupert the repurposer, who made shoes out of things: candlesticks, cheese wheels, once a pigeon. Godwin, initially flattered, grew uneasy. "It's not about fashion," he mumbled. "It's about foot dignity." But the crowd was hungry for spectacle. And by hungry, we mean there was no harvest that year, and this seemed like a good distraction from reality. The rules were simple. Each cobbler would present 1 pair of shoes. They must be wearable. They must survive the Walk of Judgment, a 10-meter stretch of swampy terrain, spilled ale, chicken feathers, and Edna's herbs, which had psychedelic side effects if inhaled too deeply. Bonus points if the shoe squeaked, glowed, or made the judges feel existential dread. The presentations. Osric arrived first, dramatically unveiling a pair of golden boots covered in lace, bells, and the wings of unfortunate butterflies. He called them the Royal Ascension. They lasted 4 steps before collapsing under their own pretension. A child threw a turnip. Marta shuffled forward, holding a mold-stained masterpiece she referred to as the organic womb. The shoes hissed softly. The left one may have been sentient. When worn, the contestant began to weep, citing a deep connection to the earth and a burning sensation. Marta smiled. "They breathe," she whispered. Rupert, never one for subtlety, presented boots made of brick and goat hair. He called them Stompus Prime. They were not so much worn as strapped to the wearer with meat twine. The tester tripped immediately, shattering one boot and possibly a kneecap. Rupert bowed, minimalist. Then came Godwin. He walked up quietly. No show, no speeches, just shoes. Dark brown, slight arch support, seamless stitching. They squeaked politely, like a mouse confessing a secret. They didn't glow, they didn't bite, but when the village elder stepped into them, he walked the entire course. He didn't slip, he didn't scream, he didn't bleed. He simply turned and said, "They feel like I have boundaries now." The crowd erupted. Victory was declared. A crown of woven laces was placed on Godwin's head. It fell naturally, but the honor stood. That night, the village celebrated with music, dancing, and 5 reported shoe-related injuries. The shoemaker's tournament never happened again. But for one glorious, fungus-scented afternoon, elegance had its moment.
Chapter 12. A Shoe for the King. The slowest commission in history. It began with a scroll, carried not by a messenger, but by 4 messengers, because it was too heavy for just one. The parchment was as wide as a table, sealed with 10 different wax stamps, each representing a department of the royal foot, including the Society for Heel Affairs and the Ministry of Soul Comfort. The scroll read, "To the Cobbler of mysterious squeaks, you are hereby summoned to create a pair of royal shoes for His Majesty King Albrecht IV the Flat-Footed. Requirements: elegance, sturdiness, ambition. Estimated delivery time immediately. Failure to comply will result in mild execution. Yours sincerely, Lady Petunia of the Royal Arch Support Committee." Godwin, who was napping under a pile of shoe leather at the time, blinked once and said, "That seems excessive." The village gasped. The king wearing Godwin's shoes? A man who once claimed that socks were emotional lies? This was either the highest honor or a trap. The process begins. Godwin accepted. He sent back a message. "Yes, but it'll take a while. I am a man of process." The king agreed, assuming a while meant days. He was wrong. Godwin began by researching. He asked, "What size is the king's foot?" Answer, large, but emotionally small. Does he walk with purpose or with guilt? What is the moisture level of the royal throne room? Then came materials. He sourced the finest oxhide from a cow that had dreams. The laces were woven from the hair of a baroness's comb. The inner lining, a blend of goose down and political regret. The sole,
reinforced with wood from a tree struck by lightning while someone was yelling about taxes. Godwin worked slowly, painfully slowly. 1 stitch a day on average, 2 if the weather was spiritually agreeable. He meditated with each sole. He whispered into the leather. He even briefly dated one of the shoes, a quiet phase he didn't like to talk about. Meanwhile, the palace waited and sent more scrolls. Please update your tracking information. His Majesty's left foot is experiencing abandonment issues. Are you alive? Godwin replied once, "The shoes are not ready, but they are becoming." 8 months later, the shoes were finished. They were not flashy. They didn't squeak. They didn't glow in the moonlight or dispense honey on command, an actual request from a duke. But they were perfect. Subtle stitching, elegant arch, soles so soft they could silence political dissent. They were sent in a carved box, resting on a pillow stuffed with rare moss. The king tried them on. He took a step, then another. He stopped, turned to the court, and said, "I feel like a man who has walked through his own sins and come out moisturized." The court applauded. Godwin was offered a knighthood. He declined. "Too loud," he muttered, and went back to his hut to begin crafting a new model, one for the common villager with slightly royal aspirations. It would be called the Humble Arch, and it would take him 7 more years to finish.
Chapter 13. Soul Evolution. From Straw to Wooden Swagger. For centuries, the average medieval foot hovered somewhere between mild discomfort and ongoing structural failure. Early attempts at shoe soles were frankly insulting. A flat piece of straw, maybe some moss. If you were lucky, a wedge of bark that still had termites in it. But Godwin saw potential where others saw soggy mulch. After crafting the royal shoes and unintentionally inventing emotional closure for the feet, Godwin realized something. The sole, the humble bottom layer, deserved more. More dignity, more strength, more swagger. Thus began the sole renaissance. He started with straw. It was traditional, readily available, crunchy. But it didn't hold up in rain, nor under emotional weight. People complained it made them feel like scarecrows trying to dance. So he experimented. Phase 1, the woven sole. Interlaced reeds glued with cow spit and hope. It held for 3 steps, then exploded like a disappointing cake. Verdict? A noble failure. Review from Edna? I fell into a barrel and saw God. Phase 2, the softwood flex. Crafted from young pine, cut thin and bent into arch shapes. Stylish, aromatic, but squeaked with every emotion. One tester reported that the shoes whimpered during arguments. Still, they survived rain. Verdict? Promising, but prone to interpretive soundscapes. Phase 3, the walnut swagger. Ah, yes, the birth of the elegant stomp. Godwin found that aged walnut, when properly cured and sanded, provided a satisfying clack against cobblestone. Suddenly, people could be heard arriving. One noblewoman declared, "I don't need to speak anymore. My shoes enter the room before I do." They became a status symbol. Merchants wore them to market, clacking dramatically with every price increase. Poets stomped rhythmically for inspiration. Thieves avoided them because stealth was difficult when your feet sounded like applause. Godwin added heel risers, not for height, but for drama. He carved grooves into the soles, which made water flee and peasants cheer. He inlaid symbols, wheat, stars, even miniature faces of people he vaguely disliked. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Old Father Hergot, the village spiritual advisor, insisted wooden soles were unnatural. "If God wanted us to clack, he'd have given us hooves," he shouted, moments before tripping over his own sandals. But even he eventually relented, because wooden soles weren't just practical. They were empowering. They made people walk taller, stride longer, feel like they had something to say, even if they didn't. One particularly loud pair was banned from a monastery for causing lustful foot thoughts. Another was used to scare off a bear. The bear was confused but respected the energy. And so the shoe evolved, from soft straw to tragic hay to trembling bark to the confident, echoing swagger of wood. People didn't just survive now. They arrived. Chapter 14. The Great Shoe Uprising of 1273. History remembers great revolutions, the peasant uprisings, the noble betrayals. That time, 3 goats declared themselves clergy. But few recall the day the shoes rose up. Well, not the shoes themselves, let's not be ridiculous, but their wearers, oh yes. By 1273, Godwin's shoes had spread across the land like a polite fungal bloom. They were on the feet of kings, farmers, messengers, monks, barmaids, and even one dog. Long story, short legs. But as demand grew, so too did expectation. People no longer wanted shoes that simply covered their feet. They wanted miracles. Shoes that made you run faster. Shoes that made you look taller. Shoes that whispered affirmations during public speaking. Godwin, now older and slower, resisted. "It's still just leather and thread," he'd mumble. But no one wanted to hear that. They wanted magic soles and ego support. So imitators rose. Factories, workshops, fast cobbleries. They cranked out inferior knockoffs, glued, rushed, cursed by underpaid witches. They looked like Godwin shoes, but they didn't feel like them. Feet blistered, mood soured. One man claimed his knockoff shoes mocked him in Latin. The village reached a boiling point. The spark, one baron's birthday. A minor noble, Baron Garth, known for his neck ruffles and chronic flatulence, hosted a feast. He requested custom gold-laced, goat fur-lined, heel-clicking boots. Godwin refused. No soul deserves that much soul. The Baron was furious. He stomped badly and declared, "Let all shoes be free, free from the tyranny of thoughtful design." Within days, dozens of knockoff knights began distributing their freedom footwear, Budget shoes with slogans like, "Two soles, one price," "Fit for peasants, worn by kings." Now with 30% less cow. People cheered, briefly. Then the shoes fell apart, literally mid-step. Soles detached, toes exploded. Laces unraveled into metaphors for poor choices. Blisters became a public health crisis. Godwin was begged to return. He refused. "I warned them," he muttered, brewing tea in a boot. But Edna, now fully licensed in something vaguely mystical, had a plan. She organized a march of the blistered. Hundreds of villagers, each limping, each furious, each holding a broken shoe. They surrounded the fast cobblers. They demanded quality. They demanded Godwin. They demanded closure, both emotional and foot-related. And on that fateful day, the cobblers surrendered. Factories were dismantled. Witches were paid properly. And Godwin reluctantly returned. He spoke not with words, but with a shoe. Simple, sturdy, hand-stitched with silence and stitched in humility. He handed it to a child. The child walked. No pain, no squeak, just peace. The crowd wept. Thus ended the great shoe uprising, not in violence, but in arch support. And from that day forward, the people vowed, "We shall never again choose speed over soul, or style over soul, or goat fur over literally anything else." Chapter 15. How the Shoe Changed Everything, and Godwin slept through it. The year was 1282, or maybe 1283. No one was keeping great records. The village scribe had taken up interpretive dance. But what mattered was this: shoes were everywhere. They lined market stalls like quiet sentinels. They hung from chimney hooks during winter festivals. They were gifted at weddings, funerals, and one very confusing chess tournament. The world had changed. People now expected to walk without injury. They took pride in their arches. Even monks debated heel elevation in hushed Latin. And in the middle of it all, the man who started it, the whisperer of souls, the philosopher of padding, the accidental inventor of fashion terrorism, Godwin, was asleep. He wasn't sick. He wasn't gone. He had simply, finally, rested. In his dusty hut, surrounded by half-stitched prototypes, cracked tools, and one deeply judgmental chicken, Godwin lay on his cot, snoring gently into a pile of moss-lined insoles. Visitors came and went. Some whispered thanks. Others left onions as tribute. One bard wrote a ballad. "He gave us grip. He gave us grace. He stopped our toes from leaving space." But Godwin never stirred. He'd done what few could, changed the world, and refused to brag about it. The legacy. Children learned to tie their shoes in school. Old men argued in taverns about lace tension. Entire books were written, titles like Sole Purpose, How Footwear United a Kingdom, and Leather, Love, and the Last Squeak. Other cobblers rose, of course. Some built empires. Others built sandals that doubled as soup bowls. But all of them, without exception, owed a debt to a man who once stitched a cow's hide with a soup bone and said, "That'll probably do." There was a statue eventually, not of Godwin himself. He refused to pose, but of a shoe, modest, curved, slightly uneven. People came from distant villages to see it. One noblewoman kissed the toe. A child asked, "Why is it so quiet?" His father answered, "Because a great shoe doesn't shout, it carries." And so, if you've made it this far, dear listener, it means you've walked alongside history's slowest revolution, through mud and blisters, through goats and glory, through squeaks and side stitches. And maybe, just maybe, next time you slip on your shoes, you'll pause for a moment and whisper, "Thank you, Godwin. I feel less like a turnip today." Now close your eyes. Let your heels settle. Let your toes wiggle in gratitude and drift off knowing that somewhere in some forgotten hut, a cobbler sleeps content, tired, and absolutely, blissfully barefoot.